Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to take a deep dive into the world of research.
Specifically, something called control variables,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
can be a little bit sneaky.
they can be. That's a good way to put it.
Mm.
They're these things that researchers use to try to make sure that they're actually measuring what they think they are.
Right.
But they can be tricky,
Yes, very much so.
especially in fields like management,
Psychology.
HR.
Yeah, you name it.
And, I think even if you're not a researcher yourself, understanding how control variables work can help you be a more informed consumer of research findings.
Absolutely.
So you can kind of critically evaluate what you're reading and not just
Hmm.
take everything at face value.
Exactly.
So for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at a really insightful article
Mm-hmm.
called Control Variable Usage in Management Research, Problems and Best Practice Recommendations
Okay.
by Jeremy Bernerth and Herman Aguinas.
Aquinas.
Yes, thank you. Published in the journal Personnel Psychology back in 2016.
Great journal.
Yeah, it's a good one.
It is.
So what we're going to do today is not just, define what control variables are,
Right.
because I think most people listening probably have at least a basic understanding.
Right.
But we're going to really look at what researchers are actually controlling for.
Yeah, the trends
Yeah, and why.
and what the implications of those choices are.
Exactly, because I think that's where things get really interesting.
Absolutely.
What are those trends? Are they justified? Are there any potential pitfalls?
Right. Are we just controlling for things because everyone else does it?
Right. And are we potentially missing some really important controls?
Exactly.
So to kick things off, let's talk about some of the most common control variables that we see popping up in research.
Okay.
And I noticed as I was reading through this article and just thinking about my own experience reading research articles that demographic factors like gender, age, and tenure seem to appear almost everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's like researchers are obsessed with them.
Well, they're readily available and a lot of data sets.
So it's easy.
It's low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, it's like they're already in your pantry, so you just kind of throw them in.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that they might be more likely to use them just because they're convenient.
Sure. And I think also there is an element of like local norms in specific research fields.
Oh, okay.
So, if everybody in a particular field is controlling for gender, age, and tenure, then it just kind of becomes an unwritten rule.
Yeah, it's like the recipe that everyone follows without really thinking about why
Exactly.
those ingredients are there.
Yeah. And that can be problematic.
It can.
Because it leads to a lack of critical thinking about whether those controls are truly necessary.
Now, here's something that I found really interesting and kind of surprising.
Okay.
The article points out that something called social desirability is rarely used as a control,
That's right.
even though it could potentially have a big impact on study results.
It could?
So for those who might not be familiar, social desirability basically means that people tend to answer questions in a way that makes them look good,
Right.
even if it's not entirely truthful.
You want to present yourself in a positive light.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, failing to account for this tendency can introduce bias into the findings.
Right.
If researchers aren't considering how people's desire to present themselves positively might affect their responses,
Hmm.
it could really skew the results.
Definitely.
So it's almost like this hidden factor
Yes.
influencing the data, and researchers aren't always accounting for it.
It's like a ghost in the machine.
A ghost in the machine. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears for a moment
Okay.
and talk about something else the article really highlighted,
Mm-hmm.
which is the significance of control variables.
Okay.
Because what the authors found is that a lot of these commonly used controls,
Mm-hmm.
especially those demographic ones,
Right.
often have statistically non-significant relationships with the things that are being studied, which means they're not actually having a meaningful impact on the results.
So it's like adding an ingredient to a recipe that doesn't actually change the taste.
Yeah.
It might seem necessary,
Right.
but it's not really contributing anything.
Yeah, it's like you're just putting it in there because you think you're supposed to,
Right. Exactly.
but it's not actually doing anything.
Yeah. And this raises the question, why are researchers using these controls if they're not statistically significant? I think there can be a few reasons for that.
Right.
Sometimes it might be due to a lack of clear theoretical justification for using those specific controls.
So it's not enough to just throw in a bunch of control variables because they're commonly used or easy to measure.
Right. You
Mm.
really need to be able to clearly articulate why you've chosen to control for certain factors.
And is that what the article is suggesting isn't always happening?
Unfortunately, yeah, the authors did find a tendency for researchers to rely on kind of weak justifications,
Okay.
like simply stating that a control variable was used because previous studies had done so.
Oh, so it's like that everybody else is doing it excuse.
Exactly, and they actually coined a funny phrase for
Oh,
this.
really? What is it?
The "because I might relate" rationale.
Because I might relate.
Yeah,
Hmm. It's catchy, but not exactly a rigorous scientific approach.
right. It really points to a need for more transparency
Yeah.
and a stronger emphasis on theory-driven research practices.
Okay, so how do we move beyond this because I might relate mentality?
Well, the article offers some practical recommendations,
Okay.
and they all kind of revolve around transparency.
Transparency.
Yeah, imagine a world where research papers clearly explain the thought process
Hmm.
behind choosing control variables.
Oh, that'd be amazing. It would make research findings so much easier to understand and evaluate.
Right, and the authors actually provide a helpful template
Oh, a template.
for how researchers can achieve this level of transparency.
Okay, I'm all ears. Walk me through it.
So it starts with acknowledging any potential control variables that you considered, even if you didn't actually end up including them in your final analysis.
Gotcha.
So you might say something like, we identified several potentially relevant control variables, including X, Y, and Z.
Okay, so you're being upfront about what you thought about, even if you ultimately decided not to use those variables.
Exact, a transparency from the start.
I like it.
And then the next step is to explain why you considered those variables.
Okay.
Was it based on existing theory on previous research findings? Or maybe just a hunch that these factors might be relevant?
So it's not just randomly throwing in variables. It's about providing a rationale.
Right, exactly. So
Mhm.
for example, let's say you're studying the relationship between employee training and job performance.
Okay.
You might consider controlling for prior work experience.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Because theoretically, someone with more experience might perform better regardless of the training.
Right.
And you could even cite some previous research that supports this relationship between experience and performance.
So you're really connecting your choices to a broader theoretical framework.
Exactly, and this applies even if your control variable is something unique or hasn't been commonly used in previous research.
Okay.
You'd still need to explain why you believe it's relevant based on a particular theory or model.
Gotcha. So I've identified my potential control variables.
Mhm.
Explain my rationale. What's next?
Now it's time to dive into the data.
The data.
You need to report whether your analysis showed that those control variables were actually significantly related to your study variables.
So I'm sharing the actual correlations and significance levels, even if they weren't what I expected.
Absolutely. Transparency is key, remember. And to go a step further, you should compare your results with and without the control variables included.
Oh, that's interesting.
Did the findings change significantly?
So I might discover that some of those initial control variables weren't as crucial as I thought they were.
Exactly. And that's valuable information.
It is.
It helps you understand which variables are truly driving the results and which ones might have been a bit of a red herring.
I love this template. It seems so useful for ensuring transparency and rigor.
It is. It's a really good roadmap
Yeah.
for anyone conducting research.
It really helps address those concerns about the because I might relate approach.
Exactly. It pushes researchers to be more intentional and transparent.
Okay, so now I'm really curious to see how these recommendations play out in real research studies.
Sure.
Are there any actual examples that showcase these best practices?
Absolutely. We'll dive into some specific examples in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm really excited to see these best practice examples in action.
Okay, so let's start with a study by Tanjarala and Ramanujam published in the Academy of Management Journal
Oh.
back in 2008.
Okay.
And they were investigating what factors influence whether nurses feel comfortable speaking up
Okay.
about problems or concerns at work,
Okay.
which is known as like voice in organizational behavior.
Right. Yeah. Voice. That's a crucial topic, especially in healthcare. Nurses being able to voice their concerns can really impact patient safety and quality of care.
Exactly. And so in this study, the researchers were specifically interested in whether nurses who felt a greater sense of personal control in their jobs were more likely to speak up.
Okay. That makes sense.
But they recognized that other factors could also be at play.
Right. Like their experience level
Mm-hmm.
or whether they work full-time or part-time could also influence how comfortable they feel speaking up.
Right, and that's where these researchers really excelled in terms of transparency.
Okay.
Because they explicitly stated in their paper, it was possible that nurses who worked full-time had enhanced job responsibilities and were more experienced as reflected in their tenure or age, might have greater familiarity with hospital work processes that might enhance their confidence about speaking up at work.
Wow. So they're not just assuming those relationships. They're really laying out a clear rationale
Right.
for why they considered those specific control variables.
Exactly. They're demonstrating a thought process that's grounded in logic and a deep understanding of the context.
I love it.
It makes their findings more convincing and their research more reproducible.
Okay. That is a fantastic illustration of these best practices.
Hmm.
Do you have another example maybe from a different field that also kind of showcases this kind of transparency?
Yeah, sure. Let's look at a study by Kameyer Mueller, Simon, and Rich from 2012.
Okay.
And this study focused on emotional exhaustion that employees experience,
Okay.
particularly when facing ethical dilemmas at work.
Yeah, it makes sense that, ethical dilemmas could be a major source of stress and burnout for employees, especially if they feel pressured to compromise their values or do something that they don't feel good about.
Right. And so one of the key control variables in this study was workload.
Workload. Okay.
And the researchers acknowledged that, a heavy workload can lead to negative consequences, partially because of all the pressure and responsibility
Okay.
that comes with it.
So they're acknowledging that a heavy workload could lead to emotional exhaustion, regardless of whether an employee is facing like an ethical dilemma.
Exactly.
So by including workload as a control, they're really trying to isolate the specific impact of the ethical dilemma.
Right. And they even go a step further and report the actual correlation between workload and emotional exhaustion, which, as they suspected, was statistically significant.
Wow. So they're not just saying, oh, we controlled for this. They're actually showing you the data
Mm-hmm.
to back up their decisions.
Transparency.
Transparency. I love it.
Yes.
These examples have been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much better grasp now of how control variables work
Good.
and why they matter. And I think the key takeaway for me is that, when we're reading research findings, we shouldn't just accept them at face value.
Right.
We should be thinking critically about the control variables
Mm-hmm.
and whether they were handled appropriately.
Always ask questions.
Yes, always ask questions. This deep dive has really equipped me to do just that.
I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Of course, it's been my pleasure.
And for our listeners, if you want to delve even deeper into this topic, be sure to check out the full article by Bernerth and Aguinis.
Yeah, it's a great read.
Yeah, there's always more to learn.
Always.
And we'll be back with more deep dives into other fascinating research topics. So stay curious, and we'll see you next time.